Okay, this is going to be the narration for the Progressive Era video part one. Okay, so we'll go to the second slide where we define progressivism. And it starts out, what is progressivism? Well, there's a lot to this idea. What is progressivism? I mean, why was it called the progressive era? I mean, it was because we had, the Industrial Revolution was hitting its second wave in the United States, really. So we had a lot of business expansion. And there's a lot of reform because as the Industrial Revolution hit its second wave, what we're going to find out is that a lot of people are suffering from terrible working conditions. And so the progressives are, in their own words, if you go back and you read people like Jacob Riis and Upton Sinclair and Lincoln Steffens and other people that we're going to talk about, but what they wanted to do was they wanted to make the society, our culture, better and safer. Okay. So that was the whole major point. Now, if you kind of dig down in there a little bit deeper, they wanted to make it more progressive for everyone, which means really at the heart of it, you see democracy, expansion of democracy. So, I mean, we have a lot of different characteristics of the progressive era. There's going to be focuses on certain things like moving, say, I don't know, forward in modernism. Now we're going to talk about what modernism means in a couple of different contexts, especially again when we get to the 1920s. But modernism, trying to make things new and improved, okay, including the factory system, including the way the factories treated their workers and all of that, right? And so you're going to see a lot also during this period about prohibition. Okay, this is going to be another kind of a renewed effort to stop drinking. And you know how that's going to end eventually. We're going to end up with an amendment to basically throughout the whole 1920s, the whole decade, you're not going to be allowed to have legal alcohol in the United States. So that's part of it. The women in the progressive era are amping up their quest for the vote, which is extraordinarily important. So there's a lot of goals, there's a lot of characteristics, there's a lot of changes, and so on. But in general, we're going to have, excuse me, the progressive movement promoting things like economic reform, which all goes into the Industrial Revolution, second wave, and promoting industrial efficiency, that type of thing. Now, you also see that the goal is to make the economy for everyone more fair. Again, they're trying to stop the big wealth gap that we see. We've seen most of history, right? We see it today. Trying to make politics more democratic, in other words, more people being allowed to vote. And in this case, the focus was heavily on women as we're heading up toward women getting the vote in 1920 with the 19th Amendment, right? And then again, social life being more moral and just and so on. Now, the thing about progressivism, though, as far as the progressive movement, the progressive era, is it's not homogenous. Remember, homogenous means the same. It's going to be different, okay? Different people are going to define it different ways. Different progressives are going to have different things that they focus on. A lot of them want to eliminate special privileges for the rich and the other things that I've talked about. And we see that progressivism, generally speaking, is going to have a very optimistic vision. Now, the part of this that's optimistic is that they believe if we come in as humans with a bigger government, that we are going to make things fair and just and equal for everyone. That's actually a really Enlightenment idea from the 1700s. The idea of direct, purposeful human intervention. again, I have in parentheses, bigger government, okay, to make things better. The Enlightenment era writers were thinking of a utopia, some perfect society. Now, we've talked about in class that, briefly, a utopia is not a real thing. It can't happen because everyone would have to agree by definition. If we had a perfect world or a perfect society, we would all have to agree that it was perfect, and we are not going to agree on anything, right? That's not going to happen. But the idea that we can intervene, we can help people get better jobs, make more money, take better care of their children, teach them about hygiene, get conditions better in factories, get working conditions better, like I said, but also the owners to cut down the number of hours and the conditions that they're working under, and all of that. Okay, this is all part of progressivism. Okay, so it's very optimistic. Now, why do they think that we need bigger government to go in there and change things? Well, it's because bullet point number 2 here. The natural laws of the marketplace and laissez-faire economics are not working, okay? Natural laws of the marketplace, laissez-faire. Remember Adam Smith, the Scottish economist, in 1776, he wrote a book called, the name of it is shortened down to On the Wealth of Nations, okay? And he presented really laissez-faire economics and the invisible hand of the marketplace. So if you put out a product according to laissez-faire, you put that out and you try to sell it in the marketplace, right? People are either going to purchase it, and you probably will make a profit because that's toward capitalism, right? You're either going to sell your product, or the people are going to say, wow, I don't want that. What is that product? And you might go out of business, right? So the invisible hand of the marketplace, the natural laws of the marketplace, laissez-faire, basically it means the government needs to stay out of the economy and let the people decide. If the people want that product, then by golly, a guy, a factory should be able to sell that product. And if the people don't want it, then by golly, they won't buy it and it will fail. Okay, so keep that in mind. Laissez-faire economics, according to the progressives, it's not working that well. Okay, we need more government intervention. Now, sometimes when we get into government intervention in the marketplace and laissez-faire is not, doing what maybe whoever thinks it should be doing, sometimes they even try to control wages. They try to control profit. They try to take over, basically, in most ways, the opposite of capitalism. If you try to take over with the bigger government, a lot of times that's going to squash capitalism to some degree, okay? Now, going to the next slide. You should roll on to the next one, okay? Really, this is just one bullet point. It says, not even progressives could agree on a definition. It came to mean so many different things that one historian said it means nothing at all. That just means that there were a lot of different forms of progressivism, and all of them had their own little pet specific things that they might want to focus on. But they all seem to have a larger common idea of progress, which is right there in the word progressivism, okay? The varieties of progressivism. Okay, so what does this mean? There's a whole bunch of different ways that we can change, that we can make things better, or at least, if we don't succeed making things better, for some people, they may say, well, it was reformed, but was it reformed in a way that was helpful? So there's all kinds of different ways to reform, okay? And the progressives disagree. And that's why we have a lot of these different things that we call reform movements. Now, some of them really are very different. We have the anti-monopoly group, and they were the ones, say, back before we're really hitting the progressive era proper, right? The people who looked at John D. Rockefeller and said, oh, the power that he has. This guy, he's the first billionaire in the United States. He's too powerful. He controls all of the oil pretty much. And he could actually control the United States just with his power. Okay? So we have this. This is the anti-monopoly group. Remember, a monopoly is where you basically have control a very vast majority of the whatever product or something like oil in the case of John D. Rockefeller, and no one can compete with you. So we have those guys who really don't like the concentrated power, and they don't like the fact that these trusts or these monopolies could wield a lot of influence in the government. And we do see that today a lot of times with corporations. Not always monopolies. Today it's become more of the big conglomerations and so on. Now, the second one here, another kind of reform type of progressivism, were the people who were really working towards social cohesion. Now, the main thing here is that very last part. The welfare of a single person is dependent upon the welfare of society as a whole. In other words, we as a society are only as healthy as our sickest member, okay? So how do we take care of each other? And so we're not autonomous. We're not out here living in a bubble. Each one of us is not an island, right? We're all connected. We're all interconnected. So the great web of social relationships, we are all dependent on each other, okay? So the progressives are really working toward us all working together for common good, okay? Again, they do have a very utopian look on this, because even today when when we're in the middle of a global pandemic, we have terrible stories coming out where people are doing really, I would just go ahead and say the word dumb things, like, I don't know, going and licking things. Have you heard of that? They're going in a store and they're licking something, taking challenge. It's so stupid. And that's why we can't all agree on things, because there's always going to be a minority of people that are just never going to get on the same page, right? So anyway, social cohesion, that's never going to happen to the extent that the utopians and the progressives really wanted it to happen. And then, of course, again, another Enlightenment idea from 1700s, deep faith in knowledge, right? Science, knowledge. The more we know, the better, which is, to me, never a bad thing. Alrighty, so the muckrakers. We've talked about the muckrakers a little bit, not much. We talked about Ida Tarbell, and I think we may have given a shout out of some kind to Upton Sinclair while we were still in person in class. But muckrakers, okay? These are crusading journalists. What they're wanting to do, the idea here is they are wanting and trying their best to put out into the world through their journals, their newspapers, their pamphlets, any kind of writing, any kind of communication. And again, this is before radio. This is way before television, but this is before radio even. So it's mostly magazines, newspapers, and pamphlets. But they're going out there trying to alarm and alert and call attention to things that they have seen that they believe the American people would not allow if they only knew the truth, okay? Now, the American people, as I said, as in any society at any time ever in the history of the world, there's always going to be people that are going to cause trouble, right? So nothing's ever going to be perfect as far as that goes. But the muckrakers are out there wanting to point out these things they felt were, things they felt were able to, that they were able to change if they had the help of the American people. For example, okay, social, economic, political, I would add to that legal, and even maybe some religious discrimination. Today we would add to that racial, and some of the muckrakers and some of the progressives added racial back then as well as, cultural and so on, right? So all of these things, what they're trying to do is show the people of America through their writings that there are bad things going on that are hurting Americans. And how do we stop it? They had great faith in the American people. They believed that if we knew what was really going on, if they could expose it, that we would not put up with it. Okay. Now, Theodore Roosevelt, my guy, TR, he accused one of them of raking up the muck, right? Yeah, raking up some dirt, kind of stirring the dirt around was the idea that, what he was talking about. He's like, yeah, they're just trying to stir up all this dirt and blah, blah, blah. Well, it turns out that name, muckrakers, was kind of catchy. Okay, so it stuck. That came from TR himself. Now, what are they doing, though? Fourth bullet point, 1, 2, 3, 4, yep, fourth bullet point. Well, they're exposing things, like I said, that they believe we will not put up with if we can just see the truth, such as scandals. Oh, there were tons of scandals going on in political circles and in, lower as well as higher forms of government, as well as in industry and so on. Same thing with corruption, all sorts of corruption at all levels of everything. And then injustice. Now, the injustice is going to come down a lot of times to things like the workers, and the pay of the workers, the treatment of women, treatment of women in terms of not just the workplace, but in terms of what we mentioned before, women's suffrage, women getting the right to vote because they don't have it yet, remember, until 1920. So they're committed. The muckrakers are going to go out there and they're going to spread these stories that they actually, they're journalists. Now today, there's a lot of question as to whether we have any really good journalists anymore in the 21st century. In the world we live in, are there really people out there seeking the truth, or are both sides seeking to prop up their own political agendas? I'll let you determine that for yourselves. But back then, what we see is that these journalists seem to have really been looking toward helping our society, okay, helping the people who had less, helping, the injustice, right? So I'm a fan of the muckrakers. I do think their hearts were in the right places most of the time. Okay, now I say most of the time because you're going to see, a little bit of maybe editorial that I'm going to give you every now and then. But they believe that we're not going to put up with this stuff. Now, they started out, it was easy to get to the railroads and get to the big trust because, again, the American people already don't trust those because they're so big. And like I said before, the American people feel that people like Rockefeller and those industries, steel and everything else, most Americans felt like, hey, those guys are too powerful. Those industries are too powerful. We need to bring them down before they just completely take over our government. So one of the earliest that we see is Henry Demarest Lloyd. Now, he's an early muckraker who's going to hit out at the easy targets, right? He wrote a book called Wealth Against Commonwealth. And in that, he's talking about monopolies, and he's writing extremely convincingly about why these monopolies were dangerous to our country. Okay, Wealth Against Commonwealth. Okay, there's our friend Ida Tarbell. We've already talked about her. Ida Tarbell was the one who went after John D. Rockefeller because her father had been driven out of business by him. So she had a bone to pick with him personally. So that's where I'm saying it wasn't always this altruistic thing, this whole idea that maybe she really wanted to just simply help other people. I mean, Ida Tarbell had an axe to grind with Rockefeller. And so she's going to write her series of articles in McClure's magazine, and all that came out in, in book form a little bit later. But as you recall, she had also got one of Rockefeller's former employees to help her, and she did indeed dig up some dirt on Rockefeller. Rockefeller was a billionaire. Did it hurt him? You know the answer to that. So there's Ida. Okay, just always identify her with Rockefeller and Standard Oil and Monopoly and so on. Okay, how about Lincoln Steffens? I like Lincoln Steffens. I think Lincoln Steffens is pretty interesting. So Lincoln Steffens is the guy that's going to be out to fight really the corruption in the cities. And he was a journalist. And as I said, a lot of these guys and women, they really do want to get to the truth, right? To the truth. Now, again, Ida Tarbell, she's one that I'm kind of, okay. I know she had something out for Rockefeller, so. But Steffens is a guy who believed there was so much corruption in the cities. And he said the reason why there was so much corruption in the cities is because your businessmen were really in charge of running the city governments. And they were making a lot of money, lots of money from running these city governments. Now, Lincoln Steffens is also going to do the same thing that Ida Tarbell had done, which is he had been given a contract with McClure's magazine to uncover some of these corruptions in the cities. Now, what he did was in some cases, they call him one of the very earliest muckrakers, but he started out in about, I think it was right at 1900 or it was 1901, I think, where he had been hired by McClure's. Now, he didn't necessarily love the job, but he wanted to do something. He wanted to advance, right? He wanted to be a writer. So what he's going to do is he's going to go out and he's going to start looking for something to investigate. And he's going to go, for one thing, to St. Louis. Okay, he's going to go out in St. Louis and he's going to investigate some of what we call the party bosses. Okay, now in this case, he's going to investigate the boss of the Democratic Party in St. Louis. And the boss, remember, if you talk about a boss of a political party, okay, back at this point in time and earlier and a little bit later, you're going to be talking about guys that really pick the candidates. Okay, they're going to pick the candidates, and there's a lot of money that goes into that. Those guys, the bosses of the parties, are extraordinarily powerful. Okay, so you've got a lot of backroom deals, the whole cliche, the cigar smoke-filled backroom deals. And you're going to have people like a guy named Edward Butler, who was the boss of the Democrat Party in St. Louis, I believe, at that time. Now, you're going to see him, for example, helping his own son get a seat in Congress. Okay, that's because of the connections. That is how powerful these bosses could be. So Steffens was going to be talking, about these type of things, and he kept hearing about more and more and more and more corruption. So he's going to go to some other cities, and he's going to go to many different places, like Philadelphia, for example, and so on. And he's going to publish several articles in the meantime, okay? And he's going to question the idea, okay? Lincoln Steffens is going to question the idea of something that's at the heart of the United States government. He's going to question the idea of democracy, okay, because he believes that these bosses are so powerful that they are basically taking over the cities, okay? So he digs right down in there. He goes to, as I said, other cities. He's going to go, I think, Philadelphia. I think he goes to Pittsburgh and so on. Now, the one that I always thought was interesting is, of course, Chicago. Okay, Chicago being one of the really huge cities in the United States, and he's going to go in Chicago, and he's going to actually in 1903, he's going to use Chicago surprisingly as something that they should model in those other cities. Isn't that interesting? I've always found that so interesting because Chicago, today we think of a lot of corruption and we hear a lot about Chicago and so on. But Lincoln Steffens came to the conclusion when he investigated Chicago that the citizens actually were in charge, not the bosses. Okay? So that was pretty interesting. It's pretty interesting. And he also surprisingly deals a little bit, I think, with New York City, but that's a whole other story. But I want you to just know what he's doing, okay, in Shame of the Cities. He's exposing corruption, okay? Now, he had always said that exposing the corruption was part of what he was doing. However, okay, you have to also read Lincoln Steffens' works to understand, if you have hey, while we're not actually going into school, and some of you probably are not going into work, go look up Shame of the Cities and read some Lincoln Steffens if you have time. But he's actually going to point out many times in his writings, then and later, he's going to say, what people are hearing from me is that there is evidence of corruption in the government. But what people should be paying attention to is the fact that I am showing the people that the public, okay, the citizens of Philadelphia and St. Louis and Minneapolis and Pittsburgh and everywhere else, that he showed to be corrupt. All of these cities have the people who are the problem, even more so than the corrupt government, okay? So his solution is that people need to take more of an interest in their own cities. That was it. Okay, they need to take ownership and quit letting these bosses and all the organized vice and that would be in those days. It wouldn't be drugs back in those days, but it would be things like prostitution. He felt like these were the real problems. It was the people. So he chastised us as residents. Marie Van Voorst. Okay, now Marie Van Voorst and her, I can't remember if it was her sister or her sister-in-law. I want to say it was her sister-in-law. But either way, Marie Van Voorst and her sister or sister-in-law are going to be responsible for a little bit of muckraking on their own. Now, Maria herself, is going to be a writer and she's going to go undercover, with her. Like I said, I keep saying, I believe it's her sister-in-law. They're going to go undercover and they're going to end up finding out what it's like for the regular worker in a factory, okay? So you have these two women who have lived pretty decent lives, okay? Pretty decent lives. And, excuse me, and they are, sorry, that is no doubt another one of these days where the turn going from like 60 degrees to 36 degrees or something is getting my throat, all messed up. But anyway, these two are going to go undercover and they're going to work in a couple places, and then you're going to see the fruits of that labor come out as muckrakers. And Maria Van Voorst is going to become a social activist because of this, okay? So what we're going to see from her and, and her sister-in-law, right? The big important thing is going to be the woman who toils. So they're going to go undercover in two different places, right? And you're going to see one of those places is going to be at a shoe factory. Okay, now again, she's coming from, and actually both of them are coming from, as I said, decent family life. You had Maria Van Voorst, her father was a judge in New York, okay? And her sister-in-law, I think it's her sister-in-law. Her name was, I think it was Bessie or Betsy. But anyway, they're going to work together on several things. But they both went in undercover at a place in Massachusetts, a shoe factory. And they also went down south, okay, to a cotton mill in the south. So they learned the truth about the working woman's lives. And they learned there were all sorts of terrible things, right? If you could actually go again, if you have all kinds of time, which I'm sure is just a dream for anybody who's in college, whether you're meeting in person or not. But if you could read any of what she and her, and Betsy or Bessie, what they uncover, you'll find that it was pretty, it's pretty tragic, all right? They're going to work also in some other places and some places that are even worse. Some of the factories that we've heard referred to as sweatshops, they're gonna work in some of those. And the book, The Woman Who Toils, came out, I believe, in 1903. And you are going to see that this book hit President Theodore Roosevelt, there's my man again, TR, hit President Theodore Roosevelt so much at the heart of what he was afraid of that he wrote the introduction to that book, which I think is pretty amazing, right? So again, I haven't looked for quite a while, but I'm sure you could find The Woman Who Toils online, as I said. If you want to go dig down into the weeds on that, you might enjoy it, you might not, I don't know. Upton Sinclair, all righty now. Upton Sinclair, this guy, he is interesting. Excuse me. In today's climate where we have the one of the candidates who has been running for president, this will be the second time, 2016, and then now on the Democrat ticket, who is actually, he's, I think he was calling himself independent at some point, and he would run with the Democrats, because today in the world that we live in, you're going to have either the Democrat or the Republican candidate for president's going to win. I mean, that's all there is to it at this moment in time. I'm not saying that's good, but that's our system at the time. So we have Bernie Sanders today running and calling himself a Democrat, but you push him on it a little bit and he says he's a Democrat socialist. Now, a lot of his supporters, I have asked straight up, I'm like, okay, you say you support socialism. Can you define it? Okay, and I kind of smile when I try to hear them define what socialism is. But anyway, the thing about Upton Sinclair is he was a socialist, and he was very upfront about the fact that he believed in socialism. Now, Upton Sinclair is going to write so many books. I mean, I don't have a clue how many books he wrote. I know that he was extremely prolific, and he's going to live to be, to a great old age. He's going to live to be 90 years old. Now, he's a writer who is going to do things that really change journalism along with a lot of the other muckrakers, okay? And his book, the one that makes him famous, is The Jungle, okay? Now, The Jungle is going to be graphic in its descriptions of the meatpacking industry, okay? That book is classic. That book is amazing. I read that book several years ago. I remember it's been a long time because I remember I was reading it on a plane. I remember where I was going, and I remember, so it's been a while. It's been a while since I read that. But Upton Sinclair was a guy who had been very proud to be a socialist. He ran for Congress at some point in his life as a socialist candidate. Now, to be fair to Upton Sinclair, whatever you think of socialism, and I have my own thoughts as I do about, everything else, but whatever you think about socialism, go and look into it and see what you think about it, which is the same thing I tell my 12-year-old son about everything. But he did eventually leave the Socialist Party. Okay, so I mean he's gonna leave the Socialist Party and I don't know, come back again, and he's gonna have this really kind of strained relationship with the Socialist Party. But anyway, his I guess the big thing about him is he had run for different offices and he, was always unsuccessful. I mean, as late, I think, as 1930 something, he was going to run as a candidate for governor of my home state, California. Okay. So you're going to see a lot of things that he's doing. And he's going to be a guy that's way ahead of his time in some ways, because at one point, Upton Sinclair is going to have a movement to try to end poverty in California. And that's kind of a way, way far runner, sort of the Great Society under Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s. It's got some ideas that are very similar. But, it's not going to happen. He's not going to have his moment to be an elected official. So anyway, he's going to be the guy, though, that is best remembered not as a politician, not for anything else that he has done. He is remembered mostly for the groundbreaking novel called The Jungle that we just mentioned. Okay. Now, just like these other things we've been talking about, these things don't come out generally a lot of times at this point as books. They usually come out, what I told you before, in what they called serial form, serial, right? Serial form. So just like Ida Tarbell, just like others, you would publish, just like Lincoln Steffens that we just talked about, you would publish part of your story, and then the people would have to wait for the next magazine to come out, the next issue, and so on, right? So anyway, what he did was he went and he investigated the Chicago meatpacking industry, and he was absolutely just appalled at what he saw, okay? Now, he wanted people to know what was going on. And so he tells the story of a bunch of immigrants from somewhere. Like I said, it's been a while since I read this book. But he has all these immigrants. I believe it starts out with a wedding. And, the immigrants are very hopeful. They come to the United States. Everything's going to be great. They end up in Chicago. And you're going to see that it was published in serial form first, and then it had gotten such word of mouth that it was published as a book in 1906. Well, what's going to happen is President Theodore Roosevelt really read, if you recall. He read constantly. Prolific guy, brilliant guy, my favorite president, right? He writes, and when he's not writing, he's reading. He did not like Upton Sinclair. He didn't like the whole idea of socialism. Theodore Roosevelt thought socialism was just a lie. So, Theodore Roosevelt, however, decided that he wanted to read The Jungle and see what was going on. And according to a lot of, things that we've heard that's come down to us, after he read The Jungle, Theodore Roosevelt himself was appalled. And apparently he said, look, is this really going on in the meatpacking industry? Is this really the condition that we have men and women working under? And so this helps pass the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act, okay? And that's very important. Those are things, imagine, today we still have, every once in a while, we still have things, I'm trying to think of one. Sometimes we'll have, for example, they'll do a recall of like spinach because there's E. coli or something. So imagine if we didn't have the Meat Inspection Act. They were selling rotten meat back then. Okay, Pure Food and Drug Act. This was all a start to where we are today, and we're still not perfect today as far as that goes. Is actually the last slide of this show. It's the social gospel. Okay, now the social gospel, this is a thing that is going to come about during the Progressive era that is also pretty interesting. I mean, we've we've heard of the social gospel movement in many different ways when we talked about some other things, but this is where it becomes specifically focused, okay? The social gospel was a Protestant movement where they were actually trying to get Christians, okay, to support and live the way they thought the Bible told them to live, okay, which meant improving things we mentioned earlier, economic conditions of the workers. Okay, again, a lot of the reform movements are focusing on the workers and the immigrants during this period. Okay, in the Progressive era, this is the era where we're going to have the largest immigration that our country had ever seen. Okay, millions and millions of men and women are coming into our country at that point in time. So the social gospel movement is going to focus on trying to help the working class, right? So economically, legally, socially, morally, etc. And of course, spreading the religion as they go, of course, right? Now, they're going to work on things, many different things that they consider to be morally bankrupt. Like, for example, a lot of the people who are teaching the social gospel and living the social gospel are going to be very much against drinking alcohol. So you see a lot of people against alcohol in this movement. And you're going to see people who want to provide education, okay? And you're going to see a lot of people who are going to set up places to educate, particularly those immigrants, right? We're going to talk about that too. We're going to talk about something called settlement houses, okay? We're talk about Jane Addams. A lot of what the social gospel movement wanted to do was they wanted to provide free health care. Oh, imagine that. We've been trying to do that forever, ever. Okay. They also wanted to provide free or very low cost housing and other things that, things that we don't really get really until much later when we end up in, the Great Depression era, and we're going to end up with, Theodore Roosevelt's cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, and we're going to see a lot of changes that cause the government to get bigger and to help people so much more. So you've got a lot of people who are going to get in on the social gospel. And what's happening is, again, we've got all these immigrants piling into the country, and so the cities are growing with just incredible speed. So the urbanization is massive, as well as the industrialization. It's growing. The more people we have, the more people we can sell goods to, the more workers we need. It's a vicious cycle, right? So they're going to focus on things, as I said, like, temperance, not drinking. Okay. They're against alcoholism. They're going to focus on rights for the people, free or at least low cost housing and free health care, focus on raising people up out of poverty and all of that. Okay. So you can look up the social gospel. I may be able to find a video about that. And I may have you guys watch a video about it. But yeah, if I do, I'll be sure to let you know as soon as I do find something that I think would be worthy for you to watch. But one thing that came out of the social gospel is going to be something that we still see today. And it's something that for a long time I had the same idea that maybe a lot of you do about the Salvation Army. Okay, Salvation Army. Years ago, I don't know, several years ago, I actually found out from one of my students something about the Salvation Army, because she said that her husband was like a colonel in the Salvation Army. And I just looked at her like, what? Okay. Salvation Army is going to be part of this social gospel movement. Now, social gospel movement leading to the Salvation Army. What do you think of that? I did never think about that. For years I didn't think about that. But yeah, if you look into it a little bit further, you're going to find that the Salvation Army is not just the guys that ring bells at Christmas time, right? They're not just the guys that have these stores that are sort of like Goodwill or anything. These stores represent an actual, really, church, okay, a Protestant church. So it's actually a Protestant church that has over 1 million people in it. They have, rank and file soldiers, they have officers, they have all this kind of stuff. They do so many things, and that includes, all the things that I just mentioned that goes with the social gospel, trying to help the homeless or people that need a place to live, for low income type people. Again, it's focused on the working class, the workers. They're going to have lots of these today, what we call thrift stores, right? So it gives their clergy titles. Okay, if you're a preacher in the Salvation Army, what am I trying to say? In the Salvation Army, I guess, denomination of the Protestant churches, then, you might be a lieutenant, you might be a major. Now, a couple of things that's different about the Salvation Army is, and that's, it's pretty interesting. They came, I believe, from the I don't know, John Wesley, I think, some of his teachings, but they don't do baptism to the best of my knowledge. Okay, I have a lot of, interest in studying religions, and I think all religions are very interesting. But the fact that they don't practice, to the best of my recollection, baptism, to me, it makes me wonder, if they would be considered Protestants by other Protestants. I don't know. I really don't know. But because sometimes that's a thing that we find, is that other different, say, Christian groups, for example, may say, well, the Quakers are not Christian because they deny the Trinity. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure if the whole thing about baptism would knock them out in the eyes of others. I don't know. So anyway, you're going to have Salvation Army thrift stores. Like I said, that's going to be how we know them today. But remember, if you do give to them, it is set up initially to help the poor. Okay, that is the end of this slide. You're probably glad, but I still miss you guys. And I would like for you to make sure that you've taken adequate notes as you've listened to this. I'm going to start giving you some assignments so you'll be able to get points. And that way I'll know that you're actually checking in, doing your work, all of that. Okay. Because I still have my child in Hardin County schools and they have to check in and all kinds of things. But as far as my class, you're going to be doing specific things that will show me that you're getting your work done, okay? So bye for now.